Wedged, headfirst, in a limestone tomb, 150 feet underground, Robert Kennedy faced an impossible choice in his final conscious moments. Continue fighting against the rock that crushed his chest with every breath. Or let the darkness take him. But what truly killed him wasn't the cave, it was a single decision made in excitement that turned an adventure into a death sentence. This is the story of how one moment of curiosity became an irreversible mistake that would haunt a rescue team forever. The spring evening of April 5, 1999, carried the sweet promise of adventure through the Oklahoma air. 21-year-old Robert Kennedy had been counting down the days to this moment, a chance to escape the routine of his life in Moggy and explore the mysterious limestone caves that had captured his imagination since childhood. The Hermit Cave, nestled in the rolling hills outside town, had called to him with its whispered secrets and unexplored passages. Robert wasn't going alone. His stepbrother Richard Steeler Jr. shared his sense of adventure, and their friend Ben Keegley from Tulsa had eagerly agreed to join what they'd planned as an overnight camping expedition. The three young men had spent weeks discussing the cave system, sharing local legends and stories passed down through generations of Oklahoma cave explorers. As darkness settled over their campsite near the limestone outcropping, the friends huddled around their small fire, voices animated with excitement. The Hermit Cave loomed before them, a dark mouth in the earth that seemed to breathe with the cool night air flowing from its depths. Local cavers knew the main passage well, describing it as straightforward but unremarkable. What truly fascinated Robert, however, were the rumors of undocumented side passages that branched off into unexplored territory. "They say there are chambers back there that no one's ever mapped," Robert said, his eyes reflecting the firelight as he gazed toward the cave entrance. Passages that could lead anywhere, underground rivers, crystal formations, maybe even larger caverns. The stories had been passed down like folklore in the local caving community. Whispers of narrow corridors that twisted deep into the earth, of formations that defied explanation, of spaces where the limestone had been carved by water into impossible shapes over millennia. For Robert, these tales weren't just entertainment, they were invitations. But even as they planned their morning exploration, fate began to intervene. Ben received an early morning call from his supervisor. A work emergency demanded his immediate return to Tulsa. The disappointment was palpable as he packed his gear, apologizing profusely to his friends. "Are you sure you guys should still go?" Ben asked, genuine concern creeping into his voice. "I know you've heard about the three-person rule." He was referring to the fundamental principle of safe caving: never enter a cave system with fewer than 3 people. The logic was simple but crucial: if one person became injured or trapped, one companion could stay with them while the third went for help. It was a rule written in the bitter experience of previous tragedies, a safety net woven from hard-learned lessons. Robert and Richard exchanged glances. They'd driven hours to get here, planned this trip for weeks, and the thought of turning back now felt like surrendering to overcaution. The main passage was well known and considered safe. How dangerous could it really be? "We'll stick to the main areas," Robert assured his departing friend. "Nothing risky, just a quick look around." But deep down, Robert knew his promise was already hollow. The unexplored passages called to him with an almost magnetic pull. This might be his only chance to see what lay beyond the familiar routes, to be among the first to document what others had only speculated about. As Ben's taillights disappeared down the dirt road, the two remaining friends stood at the threshold of a decision that would change everything. The cave entrance yawned before them in the early morning light, its mouth appearing larger and more forbidding than it had the night before. The entrance to Hermit Cave welcomed them with deceptive ease. Unlike the tight squeezes and technical challenges of more advanced cave systems, this opening was spacious enough to walk through upright. The temperature dropped noticeably as they crossed from sunlight into shadow, and their voices took on the hollow quality that marked the transition from the surface world to the subterranean realm. Robert had come equipped with what he thought was adequate gear: a single flashlight, casual clothes, and the confidence of youth. His jeans and t-shirt seemed practical enough for what he expected to be a brief exploration. He hadn't researched the specific challenges of this cave system, hadn't consulted with experienced local cavers, hadn't even considered that his single light source represented a critical vulnerability. The main passage lived up to its reputation as they moved deeper into the limestone labyrinth. Smooth walls carved by eons of water flow guided them forward, and the familiar scratch of boots on stone echoed in the enclosed space. The air grew cooler and carried the mineral scent of ancient rock. Their voices bounced off the walls in strange ways, sometimes seeming to come from behind them, other times disappearing entirely into the absorbing stone. But for Robert, the known route was merely a pathway to mystery. As they made their way back toward the entrance after an hour of exploration, his flashlight beam caught something that made his pulse quicken, the dark mouth of a side passage, exactly where the local stories had suggested it would be. "There," he whispered, as if speaking too loudly might cause the opening to vanish. "That's got to be one of the unmapped sections." Richard peered into the narrow opening, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the cave's temperature. The passage was significantly smaller than the main route, and its walls seemed to press inward with an almost deliberate menace. "Robert, I don't know about this," Richard said, his voice carrying the weight of growing unease. "We promised Ben we'd stay safe." But Robert was already moving toward the passage, drawn by a curiosity that had transformed into something approaching obsession. "Just a quick look," he said, the words that have preceded countless tragedies throughout human history. "We'll only go a little way." The side passage immediately demanded a different kind of movement. Where the main cave had allowed them to walk upright, this route required them to crouch, then crawl, then adopt an awkward combat-style movement that scraped their clothes against the limestone walls. The passage twisted and turned with no apparent logic, following the ancient path that water had carved through the rock over millions of years. Robert found himself leading the way, his flashlight creating a small bubble of visibility in the absolute darkness ahead. The beam revealed walls that pressed closer together with each twist, surfaces that wept moisture, and formations that seemed to reach out like grasping fingers. The air grew thicker and more difficult to breathe, though Robert attributed this to exertion rather than the poor ventilation that would later prove crucial. About 150 feet into the passage, the limestone corridor had transformed from a simple crawlway into something far more demanding. The walls curved and twisted in 3 dimensions, creating what cavers call a squeeze, a section where the rock formation requires specific body positioning and movement techniques to navigate safely. "This is like nothing I've ever seen," Robert called back to Richard, his voice tight with excitement and the physical demands of the passage. "The formations are incredible." He was describing the natural sculpture that millions of years had created in the limestone, flowing walls that looked like frozen water, ceiling formations that hung like primitive chandeliers, and floor patterns that resembled abstract art. For someone experiencing their first serious cave exploration, the beauty was intoxicating. But beauty in caves often comes with hidden dangers, and Robert was about to encounter the most treacherous section of the passage, a formation that local cavers, had they known about it, would have dubbed the keyhole. The keyhole formation appeared in Robert's flashlight beam like a limestone portal to another world. The rock had been carved by water into an almost perfect narrow opening, wider at the top than the bottom, creating the distinctive shape that gave such formations their name. Beyond it, Robert could see that the passage continued, promising further discoveries. What Robert couldn't see, and what his inexperience prevented him from recognizing, was that this formation represented a crucial decision point. Experienced cavers approach such obstacles with careful analysis, considering not just whether they can pass through, but whether they can return safely. They test the dimensions, they consider alternative routes, and they always think about the worst-case scenario. Robert saw only the challenge and the promise of what lay beyond. His mind was filled with visions of virgin cave passages, of chambers that had never felt the touch of human presence, of discoveries that would make him a legend in the local caving community. "I think I can make it through," he called back to Richard, who was struggling to keep up in the increasingly demanding passage. The decision to attempt the keyhole was Robert's first critical mistake, but it was compounded by his choice of technique. Expert cavers had long ago established the principle of entering unknown tight spaces feet first whenever possible. This approach allows for easier retreat and prevents the dangerous scenario of becoming trapped head down in a passage that proves impassable. But Robert, driven by excitement and lacking knowledge of proper technique, entered the keyhole head first. The limestone walls guided his body into position as he exhaled to reduce his chest size and pushed forward with his arms. The rock seemed to welcome him at first, allowing his head and shoulders to pass through the narrow opening. The sensation of moving through the keyhole was unlike anything Robert had experienced. The limestone pressed against him from all sides, creating a feeling of being embraced by the earth itself. His flashlight beam danced wildly as he maneuvered, creating a strobing effect that made the cave walls seem to pulse with life. For a moment, Robert felt the intoxicating rush of success. He had passed through the keyhole, achieved something that few people had ever attempted. The passage opened slightly on the far side, and he could see that it continued deeper into the mountain. He was living his dream of exploration and discovery. But as Robert attempted to move further forward, the passage began to reveal its true nature. The limestone walls, which had seemed to guide him through the keyhole, now began to constrict more tightly. What he couldn't see from his position was that the passage ahead narrowed into an hourglass shape, angling downward at approximately 30 degrees. The formation was a geological trap, shaped by millions of years of water flow into a configuration that could allow entry but make exit nearly impossible. The downward angle meant that gravity would work against anyone trying to retreat, while the hourglass shape created a bottleneck that could accommodate a human body moving in one direction but not the other. Robert realized his predicament gradually, as the limestone walls pressed more tightly against his ribs and shoulders. His arms, extended ahead of him, could find no purchase on the smooth rock surfaces. The downward angle of the passage meant that his legs, trailing behind him, couldn't provide the leverage needed to push himself backward. The moment of recognition was terrifying in its clarity. Robert was trapped, wedged between limestone walls in a position that rendered him almost completely helpless. His arms were useless, one pinned beneath his body, the other pushed backward by an outcropping of rock. The walls pressed against his chest, making each breath a conscious effort. "Richard!" Robert's voice echoed through the narrow passage, carrying a note of panic that his stepbrother had never heard before. "Richard, I need help." Richard's response to Robert's cry for help revealed both the bonds of family and the harsh realities of cave rescue. Moving through the twisted passage toward his trapped stepbrother, Richard quickly realized the limitations of their situation. The narrow confines that had challenged them during entry now became obstacles that prevented effective assistance. When Richard finally reached the keyhole formation, the sight that greeted him was both heartbreaking and terrifying. Robert was wedged in the limestone passage, his head and shoulders disappeared into the narrowing tunnel, his body pressed against the rock in a way that looked almost impossible. The downward angle of the passage meant that Robert's face was directed toward the muddy floor of the cave, and the compression around his chest was visibly restricting his breathing. "I can't move," Robert said, his voice muffled by his position and tight with controlled panic. "I can't push myself back, and I can't go forward." Richard attempted to help by grabbing Robert's legs and trying to pull him backward, but the physics of the situation were unforgiving. The keyhole formation that had allowed Robert to pass through head first now acted like a one-way valve, preventing his retreat. The limestone walls gripped Robert's torso like a vice, and any pulling motion only seemed to wedge him more tightly into the passage. The decision to leave Robert and seek help was perhaps the most difficult moment in Richard's young life. Every instinct told him to stay with his stepbrother, to continue trying to free him, to not abandon him in the darkness. But logic and the growing severity of Robert's situation demanded action that only outside help could provide. "I have to go get help," Richard said, his voice breaking. "I'll be back as fast as I can." "Don't leave me," Robert pleaded, but even in his fear, he understood the necessity. "Okay, go. But hurry." Richard's journey back through the passage and out of the cave was a nightmare of speed and desperation. Every second counted, but the twisted limestone corridor that had seemed challenging during exploration now became an obstacle course that demanded precious time to navigate. He scraped his knees and elbows against the rock walls, pushed himself beyond his physical limits, and emerged into daylight with lungs burning and heart pounding. The call for help brought a response that reflected both the best of human nature and the realities of technical rescue. Within an hour, 10 experienced rescue personnel had converged on the cave site, bringing with them decades of collective experience in underground emergencies and a determination to save Robert that matched the urgency of the situation. But even as the rescuers assembled their equipment and planned their approach, the challenges they faced were becoming clear. The 150-foot distance from the cave entrance to Robert's location through the twisted passage meant that only one rescuer at a time could work directly with the trapped man. The narrow confines of the route made it impossible to bring large equipment or multiple personnel to the rescue site simultaneously. More critically, the rescuers quickly discovered what Robert had failed to recognize: the air quality in the deep section of the cave was dangerously poor. The natural ventilation that keeps most caves habitable had been restricted by the narrow passages and complex geology, creating an environment with elevated carbon dioxide levels and reduced oxygen content. The rescue operation that followed was a testament to human skill, determination, and the tragic limits of both. The team of experienced rescuers approached Robert's situation with the systematic methodology that had been developed through decades of cave rescue operations, but they quickly discovered that this particular incident presented challenges that tested the boundaries of their expertise. The first rescuer to reach Robert found him conscious but weakening, his voice growing weaker and his responses slower. The limestone vise that held him prevented normal communication, and the rescuer had to position himself awkwardly in the narrow passage to make contact with Robert's feet, the only part of his body that remained accessible. "We're going to get you out," the rescuer promised, but privately, he was already cataloging the obstacles they faced. The keyhole formation would need to be widened, the hourglass compression beyond it would require careful excavation, and all of this work would have to be performed in a space barely large enough for one person to maneuver. The rescue team's first approach involved attempting to establish a pulley system that could provide the mechanical advantage needed to extract Robert from the limestone trap. But the soft nature of the limestone and gypsum formations made it impossible to create secure anchor points that could withstand the forces involved. Test pulls on the rock formations revealed that they would crumble under the tension required, potentially causing a collapse that could injure both Robert and the rescuers. With mechanical extraction ruled out, the team turned to the painstaking process of manual excavation. Using small hand tools, they began the delicate work of widening the keyhole formation and reducing the compression that held Robert trapped. The work was exhausting, performed in cramped conditions that made every movement difficult, and complicated by the need to avoid disturbing Robert's already precarious position. The rescuers established a rotation system, with fresh personnel replacing exhausted workers every hour. But even with this approach, progress was painfully slow. Each chip of limestone removed from the formation had to be carefully extracted through the narrow passage, and the workspace was so confined that only small hand tools could be used effectively. As the hours passed, the rescuers noticed changes in Robert's condition that added urgency to their efforts. His responses became weaker, his voice more difficult to hear, and his movements increasingly limited. The combination of chest compression, poor air quality, and stress was taking a visible toll on the trapped young man. "Stay with us, Robert," the rescuers called to him repeatedly. "We're making progress." But privately, they were growing increasingly concerned about the race between their excavation efforts and Robert's deteriorating condition. The limestone that had taken millions of years to form was yielding only slowly to their tools, while Robert's situation was becoming more critical with each passing hour. After more than 6 hours of continuous excavation, the rescuers achieved their first significant breakthrough. The keyhole formation had been widened enough to reduce the compression around Robert's torso, and they were able to detect a pulse in his legs, a sign that blood circulation was still functioning despite his prolonged entrapment. But Robert was no longer responding to their calls, and his body had become completely limp. The muddy floor of the cave, which had been inches from his face throughout the ordeal, showed signs that he had been unable to keep his head raised during the final hours of his entrapment. The last phase of Robert Kennedy's rescue became a desperate race against time that showcased both the incredible dedication of emergency personnel and the harsh realities of cave rescue operations. As the excavation work continued through the night, the rescuers found themselves fighting not just against limestone and gravity, but against the biological limits of human survival in extreme conditions. The widening of the keyhole formation required the removal of significant amounts of rock, a process made more challenging by the need to avoid any action that might further compromise Robert's position. Each piece of limestone had to be carefully chipped away, examined to ensure it wasn't providing crucial support, and then transported through the narrow passage system to the cave entrance. The rescuers had brought in a ventilation system to improve air quality in the deep section of the cave, but the complex geometry of the passage limited its effectiveness. The narrow, twisting route that led to Robert's location created a maze of dead air spaces and circulation problems that mechanical ventilation could only partially address. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the emergency medical coordinator who had been called to the scene, later described the unique challenges of the situation. We were dealing with a form of positional asphyxia, combined with environmental factors that we rarely encounter in typical emergency scenarios. The chest compression was preventing normal breathing, while the poor air quality was reducing the oxygen content of what little air he could draw into his lungs. The medical team's assessment, relayed through the narrow passage by the rescue personnel, painted a grim picture of Robert's condition. The prolonged compression around his chest had restricted his breathing for hours, while the downward angle of his position had made it impossible for him to lift his face away from the muddy cave floor. The combination was creating a medical emergency that required immediate intervention, but the physical constraints of the situation made such intervention nearly impossible. As the excavation work entered its 8th hour, the rescuers achieved another breakthrough. They had managed to create enough space around Robert's torso to begin the delicate process of extraction. Using a combination of careful pulling and continued excavation, they began to move his body backward through the passage he had entered hours earlier. The process was agonizingly slow and required constant coordination between multiple rescuers positioned at different points along the narrow route. Each movement had to be carefully controlled to avoid causing injury or creating a situation that might make extraction impossible. The limestone walls that had trapped Robert now threatened to injure him during the removal process. But even as the rescuers worked with incredible skill and determination, they were fighting against biological realities that had been building for hours. The combination of chest compression, poor air quality, and stress had created a cascade of medical problems that were invisible to the rescue team but devastating to Robert's physiology. When Robert's body finally emerged from the narrow passage after more than 9 hours of entrapment, the waiting medical team immediately began emergency procedures. They had hoped to find signs of life, evidence that their heroic efforts had succeeded in time to save the young explorer. Instead, they found that Robert Kennedy had lost his battle with the limestone maze sometime during the final hours of the rescue operation. The exact moment of his death would never be known, but medical examination suggested that the combination of factors, chest compression that prevented normal breathing, carbon dioxide buildup in the poorly ventilated space, and the inability to keep his airway clear of mud and debris, had proved fatal despite the rescue team's extraordinary efforts. The death of Robert Kennedy in Hermit Cave became a watershed moment in Oklahoma's caving community and provided crucial lessons for cave rescue operations nationwide. The tragedy highlighted the intersection of human ambition, natural hazards, and the unforgiving nature of the underground environment. In the months following the incident, cave safety experts conducted a thorough analysis of the factors that had contributed to the tragedy. Their findings became a case study in the importance of proper preparation, adherence to safety protocols, and understanding the unique risks presented by unexplored cave systems. The violation of the 3-person rule emerged as a critical factor in the tragedy's development. Had Ben Keegley been present during the exploration, he could have remained with Robert while Richard sought help, potentially providing crucial assistance during the early stages of the entrapment. The psychological support alone might have helped Robert remain calmer and preserve his strength during the long hours before rescue personnel arrived. Robert's lack of proper equipment and experience represented another crucial factor. His single flashlight, casual clothing, and unfamiliarity with cave rescue techniques had left him vulnerable to exactly the kind of situation he encountered. Experienced cavers emphasized that proper gear, including multiple light sources, appropriate clothing, and basic rescue equipment, might not have prevented his entrapment but could have improved his chances of survival. The decision to enter the keyhole formation headfirst violated fundamental caving safety principles that Robert had never learned. Cave rescue experts noted that proper training would have taught him to approach unknown tight spaces feet first, allowing for easier retreat if the passage proved impassable. Perhaps most importantly, the tragedy highlighted the need for thorough reconnaissance and local knowledge before attempting to explore unmapped cave systems. The side passage that trapped Robert had never been surveyed or documented, and its hazards were unknown to the local caving community. A more cautious approach would have involved consulting with experienced local cavers, conducting preliminary surveys of new passages, and establishing safety protocols specific to the cave system. Today, more than 2 decades after Robert Kennedy's death, Hermit Cave remains a popular destination for Oklahoma cavers, but the tragedy has left its mark on how the cave system is approached and explored. The passage where Robert died has been carefully mapped and documented, and warning signs have been placed to alert future explorers to its dangers. The Kennedy family, despite their tragic loss, has worked with the caving community to ensure that Robert's death serves as a teaching moment rather than simply a tragedy. They have supported efforts to improve cave safety education and have shared their story with new cavers to emphasize the importance of proper preparation and adherence to safety protocols. Richard Steeler Jr., who carries the weight of that April day with him still, has become an advocate for cave safety and proper training. His experience demonstrates the lasting impact that cave tragedies have not only on the victims but on their families and friends who survive to tell their stories. The rescue personnel who worked tirelessly to save Robert have also carried forward lessons from the incident. Their experience has contributed to improvements in cave rescue techniques, equipment, and coordination protocols that have since been used to save other trapped cavers in similar situations. Dr. Martinez, reflecting on the medical aspects of the case, noted that the incident had influenced emergency protocols for cave rescues nationwide. We learned important lessons about the physiological effects of prolonged chest compression in cave environments, and those insights have informed our approach to similar emergencies. The limestone formations of Hermit Cave continue to attract explorers drawn by the same sense of wonder and discovery that motivated Robert Kennedy. But his story serves as a permanent reminder that the underground world, for all its beauty and mystery, demands respect, preparation, and adherence to safety principles that have been written in the bitter experience of previous tragedies. The narrow passage where Robert died remains accessible to experienced cavers, but it now bears warnings about its dangers and recommendations for safe exploration techniques. The keyhole formation that trapped him has been slightly modified by the rescue excavation, but it still represents a significant challenge that demands proper technique and equipment. Cave conservationists have worked to ensure that Robert's story is preserved as part of the cave's history, not to discourage exploration but to promote safe practices that allow future generations to enjoy the underground world without repeating the tragedies of the past. In the end, Robert Kennedy's legacy in the Oklahoma caving community is not defined by the manner of his death but by the lessons his experience has provided to others. His story serves as a bridge between the wonder that draws people to explore caves and the respect that such exploration demands, a reminder that the underground world offers incredible experiences to those who approach it with proper preparation, appropriate caution, and deep respect for its unforgiving nature. The limestone halls of Hermit Cave echo still with the voices of explorers who follow in Robert's footsteps, but they do so with greater knowledge, better equipment, and deeper understanding of the risks and rewards that define the world beneath our feet. In this way, Robert Kennedy's final journey into the darkness continues to light the way for others, ensuring that his brief life serves a purpose that extends far beyond the tragedy that ended it.